Shalom to everyone and welcome to Wisdom in Torah Ministries. It's always a delight to have the opportunity to minister and to share about the Word of God. And I'm normally doing a teaching on the book of Revelation. We are in chapter 6, but due to the lack of information that I knew about that chapter, because I'm presenting it from its cultural background. And I recently read a book. I was reading a book by Ramsey, which is William Ramsey, which is one of the leading authorities back from the 1800s in regards to information from Asia Minor in regards to the seven churches of Revelation. And I found a few new things that I did not know. So instead of just sharing it without validating it, I'm taking an extra week to really read through a little bit more, be better informed. Because if this is true, then the understanding of the four horses, their colors represent something different than what we were told. So as we know, we like to study the Bible from its cultural background context. So what I decided to do was to talk about a topic that I've been looking into in my research, my studies, and also exchanging with my ancient Near Eastern teacher, Mark Chavalas, talking about fertility rituals, the Ugaritic Ugarit versus the Mesopotamia and Egypt. And as I was reading some of the commandments that we're covering in Spanish. This year in Spanish, at the local congregation that I belong to, we are teaching the commandments in the Torah portion, which you can find in a book that I put back, Taryag Mitzvot. So what we're doing, we are covering the commandments of the Torah within each Torah portion and trying to cover the best to our ability, a foundation for the people to understand the legality of Scripture in its proper context, cultural, geographical, archaeological, and also religious, clearly. So in doing so, and putting a hold on chapter 6 of the book of Revelation, I decided to take a new look at Acts chapter 15 in light of the cultural background of a Greco-Roman world and also ancient Canaanite rituals from the Canaanite period in the commandment. Remember, the Torah is given to a people living in a real culture, in an environment in which you have different religions, different customs, different rituals, and everything was basically driven by fertility rituals. When you start studying, and we're looking into the book of Shemot, we're studying the book of Exodus in our Torah cycles, and now we're getting into chapter 12 pretty soon next week, in which we're going to be talking about Passover and certain rules about Passover, certain times of the year about Passover. We need to know why. Why is it on the new moon? Why is the feast falling on a full moon? Why is it basically on the spring when all the ancient religions celebrated their feasts and their all celebrations during the same time frame in the same more or less particular way? What's the difference between the God of Israel versus the God of the so-called Canaanites and the religions surrounding Israel? We need to ask these questions, and I think looking into the ancient Near East to give us a help in understanding the surrounding cultures and how they thought, how they lived, how they worshipped, and what the rituals they did, it actually made me realize that it's not much different than what was being practiced in the Greco-Roman world. As a scholar, a student of scholarship in the ancient Near East, I also need some of the resources that allows me to understand that culture and how it migrated from Persia to Babylon, from there to Ugarit, which is modern day Syria, all the way up to the Asia Minor, Anatolia, which is modern day Turkey, to Greece, and then to Rome, which influenced the way the gospel was taught. And we notice that the Torah and the whole premise of holiness in the Torah preserve its same standard of message all the way from the time when the Torah was given on Mount Sinai. That doesn't have to change. So what we need to understand is the cultural background. How did they live in the first century? Why is the Torah still applicable to them in the first century? Does the Torah change, or do the cultures change? Or just the environment? Right now, we live in the same environment, except that we have cameras, we have microphones, we have televisions, we have transportation, but it's the same type of system of worship, but just describes it in a different way. Instead of worshiping an idol of a without speaking, without telling you anything, people now worship human beings. It's called idols or musicians, or they do singers and they call them divas and they call them, they're my idols and things like that. And they talk back to you. They tell you how to think. They actually influence you in the way you think by what they say and when they speak out of their mouth. So therefore now it's not really a difference. It's the next level of idolatry and we don't even know it. When you go back to the ancient world and you have a foundation of what that means, now you can track it all throughout generations. And then you see the same prevailing message of the Torah. It doesn't change. It's the same message to a new audience living in the same environment. It's just that it has been retweaked a little bit here and there. So therefore, my job as a Torah teacher and as also a student of the Bible is to try to highlight for you how the Torah is still the same document, still has the same strength, still has the same standards of what God requires of us. But if we are not aware of our surroundings and how things work back in the time of the Bible, Moses, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Israel in the wilderness, Israel in the land, Israel in the diaspora, Israel in the Greek influence, Israel under the Greco-Roman rule, and how those cultures function, we will never truly understand how the message of the Torah can be consistent. And this is the reason why many people give different interpretations to the commandments. Guys, there has to come a point in our spiritual walk in which the commandments of God are forever above our interpretation. It has to happen. Eventually it will. The question to you is this. If you do not understand the commandment, if you don't even know the context of the commandments, if you don't even know the essence and the message behind the commandment, and we're not connecting it with the culture, then how would we know how to get near God? Let me ask you a question, and I don't mean to be in any way arrogant or trying to judge you in any way. How many of us have taken the time to actually study each one of the 613 commandments? You may say, well, that was man-made. I mean, the rabbis put it together, whatever you want to call it, but they have a structure of commandments, just like America have a structure of a constitution. So how many of you guys have never considered taking 1 year and highlight each commandment in the Torah portions? Study them. At least try to learn them to know how do they apply, to whom do they apply. What is the legal ramifications of breaking that commandments? What were the penalties in the Torah if you broke that commandment? Who had the legal jurisdiction to give you the penalties if you broke the commandments, and the intent of what you took in order to transgress that commandment? See, these things are important to know, but we live a life of a religious nature. We never consider the Bible as a legal binding document or a legal document that has judicial laws, real estate laws, civil laws. It has a structure of a government whom God is the ultimate king. Yeshua has been placed in the authority by the power of his Father, the King of the universe, in order for him to be our future king on the earth. There's a structure of authority. There's a structure of holiness. There's a structure of obedience that we hardly ever really look into. Let us be real. After maybe 6 months, if I have to continue to tell you the importance of Sabbath in a Sabbath-keeping congregation, and that is my only topic on Shabbat, to talk about the importance of the Sabbath, or the name, or the two houses, then you're not really studying the Bible right now, because those things are basic principles that you could learn within 6 weeks, 6 months. Should not take you that long. Sabbath is quite simple. Now, the mechanism of how to do it, understanding why you do it, and finding consistency in observing, that takes a little longer. But understand the validity of that commandment is quite simple in the Bible. The same thing with the restoration of the 12 tribes of Israel. Should not take you 20 years to talk about the same topic over and over and over and over and over. Okay, fine. The 10 tribes were scattered. Now Yeshua came to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Amen. Hallelujah. But how about the rest of the nations? They don't have a part in the master plan of God? Only the 10 tribes? And then we push our theologies because we are very narrow in our approach of study. One of the tools that I use for this is called the Net Bible. It's a brand new Bible that came out through Logos. It's actually a Thomas Nelson edition. You can find it on Logos software, and you can I bought it also in hard copy. Now, the reason why I like this particular Bible. There's many ones that I have. I like this one because it's basically put together by scholars. Now, I'm not saying that I need to agree with the translation. To be honest with you, I could care less about translations anymore because I've learned my last 25 years studying ancient Near Eastern stuff and all the historical things that you can have the perfect translation, but you still need to understand the background of the people who lived in the Bible to know how they were thinking to understand a translation. Sometimes the translation is for our benefit to understand the storyline, but it's not really understanding the events behind the storyline. Okay, so let me share here with you, and I'll tell you the benefits of this particular version. There's others, but I just want to share the benefits of this one. Okay, now this is called the Net Bible, and it's actually put together by Thomas Nelson. Okay, so what I like about it is it has translation notes. It explains the rationale for the translation, and it gives alternate translations, interpretive options, and all the technical information. Guys, this is not a translation by a Hebrew roots guy who doesn't study the Bible or doesn't know Hebrew. We're not coming up with different ways of translating the name, or that's not the point. This is all scholarly stuff. If we're going to study the Bible, I suggest to you, you should consider looking for resources that would allow you to understand the text better, not from our own invention for what we think it says in our own translations. So I'm not doing that anymore. I'm going to go to the people who study this stuff. Okay? So you have translation notes, and I'm not going to read the whole thing. Okay? And then it has also study notes. As in study notes includes comments about historical, cultural backgrounds, explanation of obscure phrases, or brief discussion of context. And then it gives you, this is the part that I like. It's got TC, which means text critical note. Discusses alternative variant readings found in various manuscripts and groups of manuscripts of Hebrew Old Testament and Greek New Testament. Text critical note indicates, followed by a double dagger. It indicates several hundred instances where the Greek text underline the Net Bible differs from the Nestle Aland 28th edition of the Greek New Testament. Okay? So anyway, it gives you different options. It's not the only one. It's not the best one in the world. It gives you different options. And the benefit of it is, for example, if I go here to Genesis, they have like different little bitty numbers. See, this is text notes, translation notes. You can click there and it gives you a translation note about that word. And it gives you references, how it is used in other verses in the Bible. So it gives you at least an opportunity to study it out and to learn certain things that you have not maybe aware of. That's really the whole motivation, to have the tools to allow you to have more options of interpretation of scripture. Okay. So one of the things that I try to do, and I meet every week with Professor Mark Chavalis. He's been gracious to study together. And, I learn a lot from him. And I also study with Joseph Good in regards to anything else on the temple, biblical archaeology and things like that. He's my main teacher. And I've also had the privilege to study with Mark Chavalis, who's one of the authorities of ancient Near Eastern history and Mesopotamia. And it's great to have a dialogue with people who are willing to exchange their knowledge to make us better. And my desire is to do the same with you, okay? All right, so now watch this. Let's go right into Acts 15. And I'm going to approach it in this way. I'm going to give you historical accounts to understand Acts 15 and the events. There are 4 prohibitions. Okay? Those same prohibitions are found in the book of Leviticus. It's nothing new. But my question to you is, why did God make those 4 prohibitions, or 3, whatever you want to call them, okay, as being the minimal requirements for any believer to come into the kingdom? In the first century, that was the whole message. These people are brand new. They come from pagan backgrounds. They don't have the same level of observance that the Jewish people did. Now there's a problem. The influx of Gentiles are coming in, Greeks. Well, wait a minute. In order to understand what they're dealing with, you must ask the question, how did the people in Ephesus live? How did they perceive life? How did they perceive the Jewish people living amongst them? What is their customs? What are their culture? Ephesus is in Asia Minor, it's in Turkey. It's not in Greece and it's not in Rome. Mind you, that area used to belong to Greece during the time of Philip and Alexander the Great, but yet it became a Roman colony. So therefore, we need to understand the culture at the time when the letters were written. without dismissing the culture and the influences before the Greco-Roman world. I know I'm giving you a lot of information. I do that on purpose. Why? Because we are sometimes not asking the proper questions. We want the answers from the text, but we're not asking the proper questions to examine the text more deeper and deeper meaning, to know why things happen and why things were described to us in the Gospels. And you're going to see there's a consistency in regards to holiness and morality. See, the whole premise of the Torah is how Israel can be righteous and a moral nation. Yeshua proved that that a man can be righteous and moral. Basically, the Torah is narrowed down to this, and the commandments is narrowed down to this. God is looking from among the nations, men and women who are righteous according to God's standards, definition of righteousness, and moral, who can live according to the standards of morality within the realm of the kingdom of God. If you do those two things, then the Lord has given you his righteousness apart from the law. He has given you a gift. He's given you life, which the Torah in itself cannot be done. So now when we study the book of Acts, they're not rejecting the Gentiles coming into the faith. They are setting perimeters of conduct in order for them to be sacred space, to come into sacred space, which is the kingdom of God, the covenantal people, and thus now benefit from the fruit of the olive tree. Get it? So, but they need to change certain behaviors, just like God reminded us in Deuteronomy 7. Okay, and also in another chapter in the book of Deuteronomy, I think it's chapter 30 or chapter 29. We're going to cover that in a minute. So when we go to the book of Acts, let's read in the book of Acts. So what I'm going to do, let me share here with you. I'm going to give you a lot of information. As you know, I like to do this. I think it's important for our growth and our development in the things of the Bible. Okay, we need to learn these things, and we need to educate ourselves a little bit more on some of these topics. So allow me the privilege and the honor to share this with you. Nothing that I'm going to present to you, nothing is my own opinion. Everything has been validated through different resources. So please keep that in mind. If you don't agree with me, that's perfectly fine. I encourage you to go back and validate it. I encourage you to go back and don't believe me. Go back and look it up. The question is this: once you go back and look it up, and you will validate it because I already have, and I know the resources say it, okay, then what decision are you going to make to change your life in order to become the vessel that God is looking for? To be loyal, to be faithful, to have allegiance to God through Yeshua, our Master and our Messiah. Okay, so I'm going to read from chapter 15. We're going to go as much as we can. When we get to verse 20, then we will stop, and I'll give you all the information that I have for you. All these little yellow tags are some of the information I have here to share in regards to context and in regards to the yellow tags are designed to give you the information and my notes. Okay? And I have these 5 I want to read to you. It says, and some men came down from Judea and began teaching the brothers, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. This is the problem. And I'm not going to really focus a lot here because I already did a study on this on wisdomintorah.com on my research on the book of Acts about 4 years ago. And that's still good. So please go back to that one to refer to this teaching in particular. But we do know that circumcision is a sign of a covenant. It's not for salvation. It's as a sign of the covenant. It's a little bit different meaning. Salvation is a gift that God gives. And there's a controversy within the body of believers in the first century in regards to this particular theory. The people who were teaching this were Pharisees that believed in Yeshua. So these are observant Jews believing in Yeshua, and now they're having an issue with the Gentiles as to what to do with them. Now, they're making certain valid points in regards to Kedusha, which one of these is holiness. They want to make sure that they're not mixing the holy and the profane and the clean and unclean, which is a commandment. We are told in Leviticus 10:10, and we are told in Ezekiel chapter 44, verse 23 and 24, that we are to separate the clean and unclean, holy and profane. That's the duty of Israel, to be an example amongst the nations. But the issue is they're tagging salvation with the sign of the covenant that allows you. The sign of the covenant is the sign that allows you to come into it in order to receive the inheritance and descendants, to give you the full rights of the kingdom. Salvation allows you into sacred space. Obedience keeps you in the blessing, and the sign of the covenant is so that you become part of the commonwealth of Israel. Okay, that's why you have a passport. Okay, all right. And after there was no little strife and the debate by Paul and Barnabas against them, then they appointed Paul and Barnabas and some others among them to go up to the apostles and elders in Jerusalem concerning, let me, give me 1 second. I need to, okay, concerning this issue. So they went up according to Deuteronomy 17, and they were sent on their way by the church and passed through Phoenicia and Samaria, telling in detail conversion of the Gentiles and bringing great joy to all the brothers. And when they arrived in Jerusalem, they were received by the church and the apostles and the elders and reported all that God had done with them. Hey, I got a question for you guys. I need the answer on this one. I'm expecting you guys to give me some feedback here, okay? Please be active on the chat. The guys here inside on the room, in the Zoom. This is important. Approximately, okay, the guys who study with me all the time don't answer this one. Just allow the other ones who do not answer this one. Approximately around what time, what year did this event took place after the resurrection of Yeshua? How many years have passed before this happened? You need to know this, because if you know this, you know that the event with Cornelius already took place. So therefore now we have a precedent in which God accepted a God-fearer. He was not a pagan Gentile. Cornelius was not living his life as a pagan Gentile. He was a God-fearer. He is actually somebody who he needed to do certain steps to convert, but he was not full conversion. So what happened to Cornelius was revolutionary, that the Spirit of God would actually, would accept him into, would be sealed for Peter to accept him. And by the way, that event becomes the witness of Paul's message. Now watch, there's a resource here. Another one that is called Faith Life. Faith Life is another Bible for scholars within Logos software. Okay, it's a really good resource. Has a lot of notes. And it also has some infographics. So the infographics in the book of Acts, it tells us about what happened from the year 20 AD. And we have the death of Yeshua and the resurrection in 31 AD. And a month later, there was the day of Pentecost. Then in AD, in the year 33, was the Paul's conversion. Now, it's interesting that you have the believers first called Christians in Antioch, and it was not a compliment, by the way. Okay. Now, you notice that the whole thing with Cornelius doesn't appear anywhere. It is believed that the events with Cornelius occurred 10 years after Yeshua, around the same time over here in Antioch, but it happened in Caesarea Philippi. Then you have in the year 44, when James, son of Zebedee, okay, is actually killed. And then the death of Herod Agrippa. And then in year 49, they're exiled from Rome. And in the year 49, you have the Jerusalem Council. So the events that we are, approximately, according to scholars, the events of what's going on right now in the book of Acts 15 occurred in the year 49. Now, how many years have passed since the resurrection of the Messiah? You need to ask that question. So now we have all these years, from 49 to 31, do the math and put it up there for me, a whole bunch of years. And now they're having a message about the Gentiles. That lets me know that the message to the Gentiles did not come almost for about 17 years. Why? How do we know? Because Paul went away, remember? He spent like 14 years away from Jerusalem. He went away to learn again. The message was not directly going to the Gentile first. Paul went away and then began to teach them. And he began to do some of the trips. He's being accountable here. So now we have all this time lapse in between. That tells you that the first century congregation, this is important, that gives you the biblical evidence that the first century congregation, the first 20 years, was basically Jewish people. There's some Gentiles here and there, but they were basically Jewish people who accepted Yeshua. So the whole myth and theory that the Jews did not believe in the Messiah is false. It's fake news. We now can prove it according to scripture, according to the evidence, historical. So this is one of the examples of many that we can actually show that the Jews did believe him. For example, if they believed, that means that they kept the Sabbath. Okay? If they believed and they lived, they were living according to the Torah, they kept the Sabbath, they ate clean, and they did everything according to the Torah. Let's continue here. Okay, so now, as I continue reading, it says in verse 4, when they arrived in Jerusalem, I already read that, verse 5. But some of those who had believed from the party of the Pharisees stood up, saying, it is necessary to circumcise them, to command them to observe the law of Moses. But the apostles and the elders assembled delivered in this matter. After there was such debate, Peter stood up and said to them. Now Peter, and I'm not going to read it all because it will take me too long. I want to make sure I go into the topic, but I'm going to paraphrase here a little bit. Peter is out standing up, and he's going to relate what happened to him in Acts chapter 10. So please stop the reading and go to chapter 10 and read chapter 10 and then continue with the reading in chapter 15. Hardly ever we do that. We only stay with the narrative in chapter 15. We never consider going to chapter 10 to understand what Peter was saying and to understand the final ruling as to why the Gentiles could be in. But just like Cornelius was accepted to be in because he was a God-fearer, he was not observing the pagan holidays. He was not living in the imperial cult of Caesarea by the sea. We don't never realize that Cornelius was not a pagan Gentile worshiping of idolatry and fertility rituals. He was living a righteous, moral life inside a completely corrupt city as Caesarea by the sea, which was an imperial city constructed and dedicated to the emperor. As imperial called, they had a temple for him there. All right. So now when we get to verse 16, they're listening to him. Now James is standing up. James was the leader of the congregation. Verse 13 says, James speaking, answering, saying, men and brothers, listen to me. Simeon has described how God first concerned himself to take from among the Gentiles people for his name. Now he's giving a biblical precedent. We have to follow this information. Peter gives them eyewitness account of what happened to a real person in his lifetime after resurrection. Then James gives them the biblical precedent to understand that this is prophetic. And it says, after these things, I will return and build up the tent of David that has fallen, and the part of it that has been torn down, I will build it up again and will restore it. But that's an idiom for the 12 tribes of Israel, so that the rest of humanity may seek the Lord, even all the Gentiles who are called by my name. Okay, the word there. If we go to this, now check this out. This is just a little extra for you. If you go here for the word Gentiles, check out this the Greek word, ethnos, right? The word ethnos is using nations. Let me change the Spanish here to the English lexicon. Okay, so there's the word ethnos, right? So check this out. I'm going to go to chapter 16. In chapter 16, verse 1, I'm going to share some with you that I think is going to be interesting for you. I'm in Deuteronomy. How did I get there? There we go. Chapter 16, right here. And it came also to Derbe and Lystra, and behold, a certain disciple that was named Timothy, a son of a believing Jewish woman, but of a Greek father. But look, the word Greek here is not ethnos. It's actually Helen, which is a title for a Greek. But what's interesting when you look into the Anchor Year Bible commentary, this one right here, very renowned type of commentary, okay, and you look for that word Hellenization, Hellenes, the word Hellenes was also an idiomatic expression for one of the Jewish people who became Hellenized, who lived like Greeks, had Greek names. They were not necessarily Torah observant, but they were actually Greek influence. When you look it up, the term used, okay, Hellenistai, the term used in Acts 6:1 in Acts 9:29 to designate Jews living in Jerusalem, but originally connected with the diaspora of Judaism and characterized by the use of Greek as their principal language, especially for worship and scripture. Okay? It says the traditional understanding of Hellenists as Greek-speaking Jews is first found in Christendom. So therefore, now we know, we learned something new, that in the first century, that word Greek is, in this case, is alluding to this man who is a Greek father, is actually a Jewish dude who is Hellenized. He's not a believing Jew or somebody who was practicing the Judaism of his day, because that's an idiomatic expression. You have to understand the context of the culture to know the context of the structure of what it's talking about here. How many of you have missed that? How many of you have never thought about that? Something to think about, okay? Again, this is just by going to the resource and looking into the information, we get more clarity to understand the whole storyline. This is the reason why I'm making trips to Turkey and Rome and Greece. I'm going back in March. I'm going back to the 7 churches. I'm going back to northern Greece. I'm going to go back to Athens and Corinth and Ishmia and Cenchrea. And I want to go back and study more there and research. So when I come back, I look at this stuff, I'm going like, it's all there. It's true. Let me tell you what it means. So keep me in your prayers that the Father continues to support in this particular project so I can do a good job for you guys. All right? All right. So in chapter 15, it takes me back to Deuteronomy. I don't know why. In Acts chapter 15, we keep reading. We talk about the prophecy. Now, check what it says in verse 17. So that the rest of humanity may seek the Lord, even all the Gentiles who are called by my name, says the Lord, who makes these things known from of old. Now, how many of you have really looked deeper into the requirements, the minimal requirements of the ethnos, the Gentiles that are coming into the fold per se of the kingdom in the first century? We know they're Gentiles. The whole chapter is about how Gentiles fit within the kingdom of God, and they're going to receive instruction. And the instructions are basically the core of the book of Deuteronomy and also the book of Leviticus. Holiness laws. Okay, you basically can take Leviticus chapter 11 all the way to chapter 19 and read those chapters, and you can see Acts chapter 15, verse 19 and 20. Okay, it says, therefore, I conclude that we should not cause difficulty for those from among the Gentiles who turn to God, but we should write a letter to them to abstain from the pollution of idols. That's one thing, idolatry. From sexual immorality, which is called fornication. We will know what fornication is in a minute. Okay. And from what is being strangled and from blood. I mean, unkosher meat. They have to be properly slaughtered. Okay. Fornication in the first century was connected with ritual sex and also eating the meat sacrificed to the idols. And we already have a case of this in the story of Balaam. When Balaam told Balak what to do with the Israelites for them themselves to be cursed from within, they sent some of the women and they married among the Israelis, the Israelites in the desert, and they worshiped and they bowed down. They ate meat sacrificed to idols and they had orgies. Exactly what happened on Mount Sinai with the golden calf. Okay, so now these are the minimum requirements. Now, again, there's been a question lately. It's interesting. People arguing against the Hebrew roots. And by the way, I'm no longer really Hebrew roots. There's a group that is called the Disciples of the Way. I minister and I teach people within the Hebrew roots and Messianic Elite as well as Christians, but I'm removing myself from the title. I'm a believer in Yeshua who follows the Torah. I will teach to anybody. And I follow the Torah. I believe in the restoration of 12 tribes of Israel. I do all that stuff, but I'm tired of the nonsense and the division and all the arguments and all this stuff. I want to study. I want to get closer to the Lord. I want to believe in Yeshua more than ever like I do, but I need to educate myself and try to educate others. So I don't want to be confined with a box of an identity of another denomination within the Christian church. I'm done with that. If you don't like it, I'm sorry. Well, I've been doing this long enough that I can make that decision without minimizing anybody or where you're at in your walk. If you still consider yourself any one of those branches, welcome. Please study together. I'm not going to judge you or attack you for where you're at. Neither do you do that with me. I'm learning and I'm going to share what I'm learning. But I follow the Torah. I'm a strong believer in Yeshua. That's never going to change. Okay. And I will want to learn to follow the Torah and keep my faith in the Messiah forever. But I don't want to be put in any box or denomination anymore. Okay. So, but within the Hebrew roots, there is a mindset that, they're arguing with Christians about, the Gentiles did not really keep the Sabbath. That's the latest argument going on in the Spanish world, as well as why should a believer in Yeshua follow the Sabbath? Because in the New Testament, it doesn't say that anywhere. That's what they say. And I'm going like, they're not reading the Bible. Because if you understood the culture, if you understood how it worked in the first century, if you understood what associations were or collegia, then you will know that any believer, whether you were Jew or a Gentile, if you want to graft yourself into the Jewish people like they did in the first century, you have to do it. You have no option. You accepted Yeshua, and you have to be part of the Jewish community because they will become an association. By doing so, then you have the privileges that the Jewish people had. And it was a huge decision coming from the Gentile people trying to embrace. And how do I know? The reason I know is because this James said it himself. In verse 20, he says, but we should write a letter to them to abstain from pollution of idols, from sexual immorality, and from what has been strangled, and from blood. For Moses has those who proclaim him in every city from ancient generations, because he is read aloud in the synagogues on every Sabbath. So what is James trying to tell you? If you believe in Yeshua, if you want to be amongst the people in the synagogue, you cannot be eating meat sacrificed to idols. You cannot be doing ritual sex over there. You cannot go to the cafeterias and eat the meat and worship Apollo. You cannot do anything they do imperial worship. And by the way, the only place that they can meet during the Roman Empire was in their synagogues, because it was the right of worship and collegia. If you understood that, then you would understand that the only place the early believers could worship when they were accepted in the synagogue, was actually in the synagogues, because of the privileges that that the Lord allowed the Jews to have through the favor through the emperor. And I'm going to read you a little bit of that. Okay. What I'm reading here is the historical accounts. And from this moment on, I'm going to stay in the screen because I have a lot of information I want to share with you. Okay. And you can find this in the book by Trebelko. It's Paul Trebelko. Let me make it a little bigger for you. It says, rights of assembly and the synagogue. The prerequisite of for Jews wanting to have a communal life was the right of assembly. This should not be taken for granted, especially when it was remembered that Julius forbade most collegia to meet in Rome. Collegia was basically associations or meeting, people who can meet because of the fear of sedition. Okay? So they have certain rules. You cannot meet in certain places. It says the right to assemble is mentioned several times in documents addressed to Jewish communities in Asia Minor. For example, Julius Gaius wrote that the people of Parium, noting that Julius Caesar had explicitly exempt Jewish synagogues in Rome from the ban of collegia. In other words, no one can meet in private, but the Jews had the privilege to have a synagogue. It's okay, as long as they did it within the synagogue structure. They could follow the Sabbath, eat kosher. They had a place in the meat market where they can find kosher meat. They also had exemption from the army. They had exemption. They could go to Jerusalem, by the way, to celebrate the feast due to Pax Romana, and they can pay the half shekel to Jerusalem. Okay, this was until the temple was destroyed. Just keep that in check. Keep that in mind. It says, likewise, he permitted the Jews in Parium to assemble and feast in accordance with their tradition. Clearly, some Jewish communities in Asia Minor were granted the right of assembly when such a grant was necessary. We also have evidence of permission being granted to build a synagogue. By the way, I visited the synagogue in Cortes. So I know that is true because I was there, one of the most beautiful ones during the time there. By the way, Sardis was an incredibly important city back in the ancient world during the time of the Greeks and also the early part of the Republic. Okay, the empire. I'm sorry. The people of Halicarnassus passed a decree stating that the Jews may build places of prayer near the sea in accordance with the ancestral custom. Antiquities of the Jews talks about that. By the way, they did this in Thessalonica, which I was there, exactly in the corner where they had a synagogue of the Jews during the time of Paul. By the way, they believe that's the synagogue that Paul actually visited when he got in trouble with the people in Thessalonica. Okay. In a decree of the people of Sardis, the Jews were granted a place for prayer and a place to live in. A decree of Augustus states that Jewish buildings in the province of Asia were to be safeguarded by the ruling and theft of the temple tax, and of rolls of scripture from the synagogue should be considered a sacrilege and punished by the confiscation of property. Accordingly, we can conclude that the Jews in Asia Minor were granted permissions where it was required or have been disputed to assemble and to build synagogues, and that the sanctity of these synagogues was on occasion safeguarded by the Roman authorities. Therefore, we know now that the statement said here by James is true. So if they could not meet any other place according to Roman law, it tells you that every believer who believed in Yeshua and also followed the Torah, they have to go to the synagogue. That's why you see Paul going to the synagogues every Sabbath. I mean, he did not begin to start meeting in different places until he was expelled from the synagogues, until they were expelled from Rome by Claudius, into the whole problem in Rome, which is the reason for the writing of the letter to Romans. But even then, when they start meeting in private homes, that was a problem. That would have been considered sedition. So they were always being penalized for that. Okay, they were speaking an anti-imperial message. It was a political message. Paul was teaching an anti-imperial message. It's not the emperor who's your Lord. It's Yeshua who's your Kyrios. It's not your emperor who brings the peace of Rome. It's Yeshua who brings the peace of God on the earth. It's not the emperor who has the authority over life and death. It's the God of who resurrected Yeshua, who had dominion over life and death. That if you believe in Yeshua as your Lord and you believe God raised him up, then the emperor has no authority and power. It's not the one who gives you the inheritance in the Greco-Roman world. It's not the emperor. It's the God of Israel who grafts you in through Yeshua, the Messiah. And the message is simple. It's an anti-imperial message. It was the message of righteousness and justice. The ultimate justice was releasing us from the penalty, or in this case, releasing us from death. Okay? Hopefully this is making sense. Are you with me so far? I want to challenge you in a good way to step up in our understanding of the Bible. My desire is only that we grow together. I need you to be willing to study this with me, because that way we can be accountable. We can learn together. And sadly, people don't want to go deeper into scriptures anymore. They want to be entertained. Guys, I don't care about entertaining you. It's not my purpose. That's not my role. I want to share what I'm learning so we can grow, so we get closer to God. So when we read the Bible, we know what it says and how he said it in the context he wanted for us to understand it, because it prevails throughout generations. That God's holiness is eternal. Morality and righteousness can continue to be consistent through the Bible, through every generation. We need to learn what it is, And I'm not going to apologize for my zeal for the Torah and my zeal for the Messiah and for wanting to teach you the right thing. I'm not doing that. Okay? We need to stand up for what is right. Love is loyalty. You don't compromise the commandments for your so-called definition of love. We have to let God define what love is, and his loyalty to his commandments. And we're on a journey trying to get here, and we are here. We have to take those steps slowly so we can learn how to please God along the way to get to where the cloud leads us to the promised land. So now let's start into the information here. Let me give you some background. So I have them highlighted for you. I put numbers so I can stay orderly. Right here. The first thing I'm going to talk to you about is morality within the Greco-Roman world. We're not going to understand these three requirements in Acts 15, which is basically Torah, is the heart of the book of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, unless we understand the Greco-Roman world's perception of worship. That's important for you to understand. Worship, or imitia die, It's like imitating your gods or becoming an image of your god. It was very big in the ancient Near East as well as in the Greco-Roman world. You are what you eat and you are who you worship. Okay? Remember, you are what you eat and you are who you worship. In the first century, God through Yeshua is trying to get the disciples to return to the Lord, to the King. And he's teaching us the Torah. Yeshua taught us the Torah. He wanted everyone to recognize that the authority of the Father is forever enthroned and it's never going to change. Now he's expanding his kingdom to all nations based on the prophecy and the promise given to Abraham that in you all the nations of the earth will be blessed. It's not about religion, folks. It's not about Gentile, Christian, Jew, or Hebrew roots, Messianic, or whatever. This is about how we're embracing a relationship, a covenantal relationship, that when we go in, we begin to behave and act the way God's kingdom is supposed to behave, which has rules of how to dress, how to live, how to eat, how to behave, distinct from the nations. So we are in this world, but we are not from this world, the cosmos. We are helping to restore God's visual idea of an ideal cosmos. We are trying to convey the message of God's cosmology. How? Through behavior, through action. Okay? So what did the Romans, how did they live? If you understand how they lived, then Acts 15 is going to make sense. Then the book of Leviticus is going to make sense. Then the book of Numbers is going to make sense. Then the whole Kings era, first, second Kings, first, second Chronicles is going to make sense. The prophets will make sense because it's all the same thing. How God requires Israel to live a standard of holiness and also righteousness, that they're not living as his image on the earth, and God is having issues with them because they have a greater responsibility as the representatives of God on the earth. Okay? Several features of the social organization contributed to the debasing of morality in the first century. Slavery gave occasion for cruelty and sexual license. The punishment of criminals, notably through sentencing to the mines and execution by crucifixion, show the brutality of the times. The gladiatorial contests and the wild beast fights discussed below reflect a brutal and cruel outlook on the Roman particular lifestyle. The Roman policy of bread and games to keep the populace content prevented initiatives and emphasized sensual satisfactions. Paul's judgment on Gentiles' morality in Romans chapter 1 through verse 18 and 32 is a great example of this. He finds considerable confirmation in other sources of the time. Both Jewish and Christian writers agreed that the Greco-Roman world was characterized by moral corruption. The Jewish apologists said that the low morality sprang from idolatry. Sex sins were prevalent, and nearly all of the catalog of sins in the New Testament has so many synonyms with licentiousness. 1 Corinthians 6:9, Galatians 5:19, Colossians 2:3. Guys, these are different geographical locations. 1 Corinthians is in Corinth. Galatians is in Galatia, which is a province of Asia, which is in the middle of Turkey today. Then you have Colossians, which is actually in Asia Minor, near Laodicea, south of Laodicea, which I will be there in about a month. The numerous words in the Greek language for sexual relations suggest a preoccupation with these aspects of life. Homosexuality was a common result in Greek society, which considered the noblest form of love to be friendship between men. Some of the greatest names in Greek philosophy regarded it as not inferior to heterosexual love. So imagine living in a culture that a man can be homosexual, but if he took the passive role, he is shamed. Okay? If he took the active role, then he's just being a man. How about that? That makes no sense. So when it says effeminate, it was a man in the first century who had long hair or who took the passive role, which was a very shameful thing in the Greco-Roman world. Well, guess what? Paul says this whole thing is nonsense. Whether you take the passive or the aggressive role. It doesn't matter. It's also homosexuality forbidden according to the morality standards of the Torah. Talk about making a distinction in the way you walk, the way you live, the way you think, and the way you behave. And you're surrounded by all of that influence in Ephesus and Pergamum and Greece and Corinth and Thessaloniki and all these places where the believers lived. I mean, the pressures of society and being endorsed by society, and you have to hold to a high levels of standards of holiness and righteousness. That's when your faith is truly tested. And after the destruction of the temple, it got even worse for the believers. We never think about these things. That's why the tone changes. Look at the books. Let me go back to that infograph. Let me go back to it. I think it's right here. Yes. Check this out. Hopefully this makes sense. I pray that you guys are enjoying yourselves here and learning something new. To watch. Let's look at some of the events. Okay? You have from 50 to 100, the books of the New Testament were written. Now, some books are written before or after. Okay? The destruction of the temple. You have to consider the tone of the Bible, of the letters of Paul after the destruction of the temple in some of the letters. It changes. Some of the things change. Okay? So when you look into the structure and you look into the age and the time frame when the books were written, you now have to consider which are the emperors during that time frame, because they set policies that actually harm the Jewish people and any one of the Jews who believe, and any one of the Gentiles who believe like the Jews, including the believers in Yeshua. So now you have the geographical locations. Then you have the emperors. Then you have the destruction of the temple. The destruction of the temple in the year 70 created a backlash for all Jews and believers in Yeshua who were Jewish and Gentiles, because they all believe in the same structure of faith. So you have to read the letters considering that. When was the letter of Revelation written? After the destruction of the temple, during the reign of Domitian. Well, do you know who that emperor was? Do you know what rules did he set? Then you have Romans, and then you have Corinthians being written at a certain time. You have to consider that to know what's going on in the letter, to better understand the language and to whom it's being addressed. We don't do that. We read a verse from each of the letters out of context, without knowing the location, without knowing their problem, without asking the proper questions. Even 15, 20 years difference between letters. And we try to apply a biblical principle from a Christian perspective on a letter that was not addressed to you, in a geographical location you've never been to, under leadership of an emperor that you never studied. Because the only ones people really know is Caesar, but they don't realize that Caesar is a title. They had names, just like Herod. That was a title. They had real names. So once you understand the Greco-Roman world, the whole scope of it, then the letters is going to make sense. Then Paul, you're going to realize how much on point Paul was in regards to his Torah observance. No way did he ever do away with the Torah. Ever. He is contrasting it with the real events that is going on in the real world during the time that he was teaching. Okay? I want you to know he died before the temple was destroyed. Just keep that in mind when you read his letters. Okay? All right. So let's go here. I was reading on number 1 here. Let me continue. And it says, where was I? All kinds of immoralities. I'm reading here in 21. All kinds of immoralities were associated with the gods. Not only was prostitution a recognized institution, but through the influence of fertility cults in Asia Minor, Syria, and Phoenicia, it became part of the religious rites of certain temples. Thus, there were 1,000 sacred prostitutes in the temple of Aphrodite at Corinth. Dio Chrysostom, in his discourse, he said is the only Gentile author known to have attacked brothels on moral grounds. Okay? So this gives you an idea of more or less what's going on. So now you know that there was a high level of immorality within the first century in the Greco-Roman world. Makes sense why you have now these particular rules. So there was such a thing as cafeterias. Okay, I think I have the note here somewhere. I want to read it to you. Cafeterias. There you go. Meet two idols. Check this out. Have you read? You remember that expression by Paul? Um, in Spanish, it makes more sense than in English right now. He was able to ¿cómo se dice? Todo me lícito, pero no me conviene. I'll think about it in a minute. I'm thinking in Spanish right now. But mis two idols. There were cafeterias. They found cafeterias everywhere, adjacent to the temples. Okay, they all had cafeterias because they had meat sacrificed to idols. Thus, they needed to do something with the meat. So therefore, they will sell in the market, or they had cafeterias that during the games they will prepare them, and every Roman citizen had the right to eat of the meat sacrificed to idols. That's why Paul says that he has certain freedoms, but he was not exercising them. He was a Roman citizen. Okay, that's what he's talking about. Says, watch this: meat to idols, offering of animals sacrificed to a god. Most religions of the ancient Near East had laws regarding offering sacrifice to the gods. Israel laws in Leviticus 1 through 8 and 16:17 talks about sacrificing it to God. And you eat that meat. It's called kosher. It's dedicated to the God of Israel. Therefore, we partake of it. That's why I don't eat halal meat. I know there's no God of the Muslims, but because we know that there's a ritual, whether symbolic or not, is dedicated to that God. So therefore, I don't eat it because I know better. It says not to. Okay? Part of the ritual was for the people to eat some of the sacrifice. They believed that God and the people came closer by partaking of the same animal. Since most Christians had Jewish backgrounds, a problem arose in the church when Gentiles converts ate meat that had been sacrificed to idols. The Jerusalem Council decided that believers should abstain from eating meat sacrificed to idols so as not to cause weak believers to stumble. Okay? Because it's a command. You're not supposed to eat anything sacrificed to idols. Remember that the people in Israel during the time of Balaam and Balak, the people died because they were eating meat sacrificed to idols. So all of a sudden we come to Yeshua and now we don't pay any attention to where we eat. You know, if we go and eat meat sacrificed to idols, I'm not talking about, look, there's some restaurants that people go to that have decorations. Okay, that's why they have strict kosher laws, and that's something we'll talk about in the future. Okay, but that's not really what I'm trying to address right now. I'm talking about meat sacrificed to idols. We need to understand what that is in the first century to know why the Jews and the converts who were Gentiles who came into the synagogue, they were actually living like Jews. So that's the reason why at one point I was not eating kosher, and now I'm eating as much as I can. You know, I'm making that effort, training myself to do what is right because we're getting closer to the proper understanding. Okay, this is it's a transition that we go into. Okay, so as we're going through this here, we understand these principles. So let's go back to the book of Acts and give you some more information here. So now we talk about the immorality going on, the social morality that's going on in the first century. Okay. Now we go into number 2 right here, Canaanite worship. We need to talk about Canaanite worship because if the laws were taken, is this making sense to you guys? You enjoying yourself? Okay. I highly encourage you. And by the way, if you notice my notes, at the end, I put all my bibliographies. You can take a picture of the screen and go back and look it up. Go back and read it. Please do that. Don't just believe what I'm telling you. Go back and find out for yourself. You will be really, truly blessed if you do that. Okay? All right. So if, let me ask you all a question. Do you think James is going to come up with new rules of behavior for the believers? Or is he going to state something that they lived in the first century and they understood through the Torah? But I remind you, okay, that they did not have the New Testament as we have it today. When these things are taking place, remember, when do we agree that the meeting here in the book of Acts took place? Around what year? The year 50, more or less, right? 49. The evidence of the scholars tell you that the New Testament letters were written somewhere after that, or the New Testament letters. Would you agree with me on that? Okay. They were standardized, and meaning that they were written not as a canon, but as letters of correction through the congregations. And we know that exists because in Acts 15, James and the elders sent letters with Paul and two witnesses all through the congregations to they will know that these people, Paul and Barnabas, they will speak on behalf of the leadership too, that they were in order. Okay? So what would James be teaching them from? As a matter of fact, have you ever studied the book of Corinthians? First Corinthians. Just go from chapter 1 to chapter 11. Have you ever connect how many commandments Paul used from the Torah portion, Kedoshim, in order to teach the people in Corinth how to abstain from things that were immoral? Do your research. I did it. It's quite interesting. The commandments in the Torah, and you start going through that, and you go back to First Corinthians, you'll be shocked how many commandments Paul is alluding to in his letter to Corinthians, taken from the book of Leviticus. You'll be shocked. But if you don't study the Torah, you're never going to see it. Okay, you eliminate the Torah, then you're not going to have instructions. Okay, so watch this. We need to now trace from where did James got everything he got from in Acts 15. Why is that the minimum requirement? Was the practice the same all the way from the time of Abraham? All the way to the Greco-Roman world, even to today? Homosexuality still prevails today. Idolatry still prevails today. Meat sacrifice to idols still. I went to China. I'm telling you, it was a nightmare. Eating in those places. Okay? So, watch this. The religion of Canaan. Canaanite worship. They live in mythological, the Ugaritic or Ugarit. They had a mythological kind of theology. It was all based on mythology. You have the what is called the Baal cycle, the cloud rider Baal, okay, and then you have the cycle. It's how Baal became king. The fight between Baal and Yam, see, he was taken captive by Mot, death. And then how Anat, who was his daughter and sister, I think it was a sister and wife. I don't know what it was. One of the two. And I can't remember right now. How she convinced Mot to release Baal. And then Baal requested for a palace to be constructed, which the god of the pantheons in the Ugarit, El, right, now builds a temple, a palace for Baal called Baal Saphon. Keep that in mind when you get to Exodus 14. Pay attention to this because they're going from Egypt. God is delivering them from Egyptian captivity, and he's going to teach them how to behave in the land of Canaan under the mythological understanding of the Canaanite religion. It was all based on fertility rituals. The same thing that was going on in the Greco-Roman world. Remember the history. You have the Canaanites, the Ugarit. It's not necessarily an ethnic group. It was more like an area which had different clans, 7 nations. Okay? And the Ugarit, which is modern day Syria, somewhere there north of Lebanon, somewhere in Syria, near Padam Aram. Please seek out information from Professor Mark Chavalis. You can find him on Logos software and also in some of his books. Amazing stuff. I highly recommend it. Okay? But they had religion. And their worship was based on what they believed. So they were imitating their God. Everything from the feasts to the sexual behaviors. Everything dealt with fertility rituals. So now you have to ask the question. When the temple is set up, everything is to contrast how the Canaanites lived versus how God required of his people to be righteous and moral. So every single thing in the feast is as a counter fertility message, just like Paul's message was a counter imperial worship message. So was the anti-fertility ritual. So they used to believe in the apotropaic worship or chthonic worship. It's the worship of the demons and the dead and fertility rituals and all that stuff. And the temple says, no, it's about life, where demons is not a priority, where death is not the main thing. God gives us the power over death. So the temple is all about life. Is this making sense to you? Are you with me? Okay. So we need to learn these things. I'm excited to learn this. Man, you don't understand how much time I spend on this. You know why I do it? Because I want to get closer to the Lord to the best of my ability. Do I still fail like everybody else? Of course, we're learning, we're growing. But the more I'm learning, the more I realize how much I do not know. Man, and I'm excited to have the opportunity to learn and to get closer and to have better understanding. Talk about freedom. The freedom to read the Bible says, oh man, thank you, Lord. I know what you mean. I know what you're talking about. I'm not going to do that because I know now what I mean. It's not like, well, I need a revelation from God and Lord, please speak to me. And we have 66 books where he's speaking to everybody. But we don't do what he says. We want a special voice talking to us individually as if we are that special. When he already made us special. He already has made us his kingdom. He already allowed us to come near him through Yeshua the Messiah. He gives us instructions, but we still want to have our own interpretation. That's the problem. We don't change. God has been the same. The culture has been consistent. Different leaders, different name of countries, different languages, same homosexuality, rape, injustice, oppression, persecution, murders, idolatry, same problems. And God is looking to us to make a difference. But then when somebody says something and someone stands on truth and they're adamant and they're strong with it, we're arrogant and we don't have any love. But wait a minute. When does the commandment of God takes its right place in our life? When does the authority of God actually takes the proper place in our lives? Why does anything has to be spiritually reinterpreted to appease our beliefs and where we're at today? Remember, when we come to the Lord, we created our chaos. If we would have done what was right back a long time ago, I moved away from God for 12 years. I ran from him because of religion. And I made a lot of bad decisions. And I'm grateful that he had mercy on me. He preserved me even though I don't deserve it. He granted me a wife who loves me and children who actually respect me. Gave me the opportunity to teach the Torah of God to the nations through the faithfulness and through the grace that he gave me through Yeshua the Messiah. But I still have to be accountable and responsible and accept that I made decisions that caused chaos, and the Torah is trying to rectify that. I cannot now expect God to just do everything like this when he gives me the instructions to stay on his path of righteousness, holiness, and morality. I need to make the decision because I created the chaos. He cleaned the slate. He gave me an opportunity, but I cannot use my past to now reinterpret the Bible to apply to my issues that I created. God gave me forgiveness. Now I got to man up and say, I took responsibility. I'm moving forward. I may struggle today, but tomorrow I'll make it better. He is good and he is kind. And we owe him better than what we're giving him right now. More so. Okay? So let's continue here reading. Let's talk about Canaanite worship, and it's going to make sense as to why the instructions were so direct by James, and they're consistent with the Torah. All right? The religion of Canaan revolved around the elaborate system of rituals, primarily the Canaanite cult centered upon forms of worship that promote sex and fertility. Such an emphasis sprang logically from the Canaanites' belief that sustained the cycle of life and death, was absolutely vital for the fertility of their flocks. I want you to keep that in mind. Fertility of their flocks, fields, and wives. The rituals, they aim chiefly to invoke the gods' favor upon the worshiper by manipulating the divine through magic. Productivity was assured. One form of Canaanite manipulation was the practice of child sacrifice, like the worship of Moloch, especially the offering of firstborn sons to the gods. This ancient society believed that if they gave the first of their offsprings to the gods, talking about the Canaanites, then the gods would continue to grant them fertility to Canaanite women. By sacrificing children, the Canaanites also hoped to compel the gods to intervene in life-threatening situations, like in 2 Kings chapter 3, verse 27, which says, he took his firstborn son. This is a king of Moab, by the way. He is fighting with another king. He's not winning, so he says, hey, I got a great idea. Let me take my firstborn, my prince, and I'm going to sacrifice him so I can get victory. Watch. He took his firstborn son, who was to become king in his place, and offered him as a burnt offering on the wall. Great wrath came upon Israel, and they withdrew from him and returned to the land. Archaeological discoveries of Carthage include the charred remains of children of child sacrifice. Historical records and stone monuments indicate that these victims were sacrificed in order to gain the God's favor and intervention. Temple prostitution was another common practice the Canaanites used to gain the gods' goodwill. Male and female prostitutes attached to the central sanctuaries and shrines were known in the Old Testament and Canaanite literature as the Kedoshim, or the set-apart ones, like in 1 Kings 14:24, which says, there were also male shrine prostitutes in the land, and they did according to all the abominations of the nations, which the Lord had driven out from before Israel, the Israelites. Okay? Chapter 15, verse 12. He put away the male shrine prostitutes from the land, and he removed all of the idols from his ancestors made. 2 Kings 23:7. He tore down the shrines of the male shrine prostitutes, and also the weaving shrines for the Asherah. There were individuals set apart from special functions of ritual prostitution. The Canaanites, though thought that the acts of whoredom at the sacred precincts were guaranteed. Let me read that again. That was terrible reading by the Puerto Rican guy right now. The Canaanites thought the acts of whoredom at the sacred precincts would guarantee the fertility of their people, the land, and animals. Now, let me make a stop right here, and let us read Deuteronomy chapter 7. Instead of reading all the way through, I'm going to read from verse 7 to verse 14. Now, he's taking them into the land of Canaan. He told them about the 7 nations that were going to be thrown out because of the abominations. And it says, Adonai loved you and chose you not because of great numbers exceeding all the peoples, for you are fewer than all the peoples, but because of the love that the Lord of God. By the way, the word love in the ancient Near East represented loyalty. So don't tell me you love me. You don't want to obey God's commandments. Okay, it's like expecting your wife to love you when you are unfaithful to her. It's not going to happen. Okay? It says, for you, and you become his keeping of the oath that he swore to your ancestors. The Lord brought you out from a strong hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. So know that the Lord your God, he is God, the trustworthy God. Maintain his covenant and his loyal love. There's a writer named Moran. He did an article about love, ahava, in the ancient Near East. Amazing article, highly recommended. With those who love him and with those who keep his commandments to 1,000 generations, but repaying those who hate him in their own person to destroy them. He is not slow with those who hate him in their own person. He repays them, so that you shall keep the commandments and the rules and the regulations that I'm commanding you today to observe them. Now watch this. And then, because you listen to these regulations and you diligently keep and do them, then God, the Lord your God, will maintain his covenant and his loyal love that he swore with your ancestors. Pay attention. He will love you. He will bless you. He will multiply you. He will bless the fruit of your womb. He will bless the fruit of your soil, your grain, your oil, your olive oil, the newborn calves of your cattle, and the newborn lambs of your flocks in the land that he swore to your ancestors to give you. Not Baal, not Astarte, not Asherah, but the God of Israel. You shall be blessed more than all of the peoples among you, and there shall not be sterility and barrenness, even among domestic animals. Guys, that only makes perfect sense if you understand how the people living in that environment believed and they lived. That they lived based on fertility rituals. Now remember, with that being said, that means that everything done in the temple is a counterculture message. Nothing connected with fertility was tolerated in the temple of God. This is the reason why you need to learn the temple. If you do not understand the temple protocols, the rituals, and its laws, you're not going to understand God's holiness, sacred space, morality, and also how to worship him. I hope that's making sense. All right? So they believe that the Canaanite gods promise fertility based on ritual sex. God says, no, I'm the one who blesses those things. I give you the rain. I give you the everything for you to be blessed and be fertile. It's not fertility rituals. It's not the sperm of Baal in the rains during the spring, the late winter, early spring, that brings the fruit of the ground. That's why now you have what is called the first fruits. Is taken to the temple. Because everyone in the Canaanite culture were taking their first fruits and their belief of a sexual encounter between the Mother Earth, that's where it comes from, fertility rituals, and the sperm of Baal, who was providing the storm and the rains. They had a cosmic sex, and the fruit of the land was the product of what was dead, now has come alive. So the Bible calls the spring the time of life in the book of Genesis 18, verse 14. Because it was the time of life. It was the spring, resurrection message. So God says, no. Everything dealing with resurrection in the Bible or in society here on the earth is because I did it. Not because Baal did it or because it was fertility rituals that requires you to have debasing sex in order for you to be blessed. God is setting the standards of holiness and also conduct. And that's exactly the same expectation taking place in the first century. Okay? So let's continue here. Let's go to the note. Temple prostitution of Canaan. I already read. No, I haven't read that. It says, likely centered on the worship of the divinity of Baal Peor. A name literally meaning, watch this, the Lord of the opening. That's what the name Baal Peor. Remember, God hated this. He said it. He destroyed many people because of what happened here. A reference to the female vagina. As an example of the Canaanite influence among all the people, Numbers chapter 25, verse 1 through 3 is about this. It says, when Israel dwelt in Shittim, the people began to prostitute themselves with the daughters of Moab. And they invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods. And the people ate sacrifice to idols, worshiping the gods, idolatry. And they joined themselves together with Baal Peor, and Adonai became angry with them. The three things that are forbidden in Leviticus, the three things that are forbidden in Acts 15, are exactly the three things that were practiced here in the story of Baal, Peor, when Balaam told Balak what to do with the children of Israel. Okay? So it's important that we understand this. Hopefully this makes sense. It says, Numbers 25, 1 and 3 reports that by fornicating with the followers of Baal Peor, the Israelites were seduced into worshiping this God. The illicit sexual activity symbolized Israel's unfaithfulness to her God, the Lord. The passage graphically depicts this infidelity, the perversion by using the sexual term coupled or joined together to describe Israel's union with Baal Peor. Baal means another husband, another master. As verse 1 relates, Israel began to play the harlot with the daughters of Moab. Even though God has strictly forbidden the Hebrews to do so, for other instances, you see other verses that talk about this. In Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 3, it says, your eyes have seen what the Lord did to the case of Baal Peor. For each man that follows after Baal Peor, for the Lord your God destroyed from your midst. Why? Because they are eating meat sacrificed to idols, doing fornication, which is ritual sex, and idolatry. Exactly the same problem in Acts 15. So if this is the letter that was given to the believers in Acts 15 for the believers in Yeshua, that means that we are to follow Torah, the same standard. So why are people not doing this? Why don't we pay attention to what we eat and what we do? How we worship? Syncretism is the biggest problem within Christianity, Messianic movement, and the Hebrew roots. Syncretism. We want to worship God the way we want to do it, not the way He prescribed. And we are all guilty on this. All of us were guilty. We all need to repent and consider our ways. Canaanite religion was also idolaters. Its various gods were depicted in human form, fashioned out of wood and stone. The goddess of Canaan were generally represented in iconography as naked females with exaggerated and distorted sexual parts, just like the cult of Artemis or Diana. Cult objects such as lilies represented sexual appeal, and serpents symbolize fertility and fecundity. Now you have serpents is a motif throughout the ancient Near East. You got the serpent in the garden. You have the serpent everywhere in Egyptian motif. You have the serpent also being related in all ancient cultures. You have the serpent also in the Greco-Roman world because it represented something, fertility and fecundity. And it says we're often associated with the worship of the Canaanite goddess. Thus, the Canaanites' obsession with sex and fertility was further demonstrated in their idols. Most worship occurred at high places, sacred sites where the Canaanites placed altars for sacrifice, ritual pillars, or idols, like in 1 Kings 14:23. Says they also build themselves high places and stone pillars and sacred poles on every high hill and under every green tree. One of the most important objects of each high place was a sacred tree or grove, a physical representation of the goddess Asherah. This female deity functioned mainly as the goddess of fertility. When the Canaanites went to a high place to worship Asherah, they were trying to persuade her to make their land, animals, and themselves fertile and productive. They were practicing ritual sex. So there's a contrast that the Levites, when they're singing, when I look to the hills, from hence my salvation come from. Remember, you have the hill of the Lord, and then you have the hills of the pagans. My salvation comes from the Lord who made the heavens and the earth. He's the one who gives rain at his proper season. He's the one who blesses the fruit of your womb. He's the one who blesses the fruit of the land. Guys, we need to return to the Lord. We need to trust Him, to depend on Him, and not to mix among the Gentiles and their customs. We are in this world, but we are not of this world. That's really what it means. We are to live according to different standards of holiness. But if we don't study what holiness represents to God, how can we know that we are separated for Him? And that happens because we reject the temple. Rejecting the temple keeps us in the dark. We don't know how to please Him in the ways that He deserves. Hopefully that makes sense to you guys. Let's continue. Almost done here, and then I go to the next note. It says, in addition, numerous biblical references like in Deuteronomy 18, 9, 11. Says, when you come into the Lord and to the land that the God your Elohim is given to you, you must not learn to do like the detestable practices of those nations. There shall not be found among you one who makes his sons or his daughters go through the fire. Thus we have abortion today. Or one who practices divination. You can consider some of the prophets in the church borderline divination, if not divination, because the Lord has not spoken and they still prophesying using God's name. Oh, Lord, have mercy. Or an interpreter of signs, or a divination, or a sorcerer, or one who casts magic spells, or one who consults a spirit of the dead, or a spiritist, or one who inquires of the dead. So that means that the temple was devoid of every single one of those things. That's why the temple service was done in silence. That's why the entrails were burned on the altar. They could not eat the entrails or the offerings. So no one will say that they're doing divination by reading of the liver. That's what they used to do, reading of the liver. That's why they would not eat any of the offerings in the area of the priests or the holy place or the holy holies. It was forbidden to eat anything in those areas of any of the sacrifices. They have to eat it in some of the cafeterias adjacent to the buildings in consecrated areas, but not in the areas where the service took place. This is the reason why in the altar, none of the sacrifice was slaughtered on the altar, because the pagans would slaughter their animals on the altar to the fertility gods. In the temple, they were slaughtered north of the altar, and later their meat was placed on the altar. A complete contrast to the way that it was done. That's why women were not allowed to go a certain threshold in the temple, and they had to be virgins because of the so-called prostitution, because of priestesses that they had in Mesopotamian temples, and they also had in other temples in Egypt. They were women priests. Women were never allowed to be priests in Israel, ever. So you hear people in the kingdom of God saying, I'm a priest in the order of Melchizedek, and you're a woman. That makes no sense. I'm sorry. I know I'm ruining some people's theologies, but in the Bible, women were never allowed to be priests. Always the sons of Aaron. That doesn't mean that we're not a nation separated for God. But you cannot call yourself a priest because that's never been a denomination or office of a woman in Israel. That doesn't mean you don't belong to the kingdom. We're talking about the office of the priesthood, okay? We need to learn the Bible, folks. We are preaching stuff that if a Jewish person hears you, they're going to be like, what are you talking about? The Bible says something completely different. It's important to understand these terms. Hopefully that makes sense. All right? So now we know that the whole fertility cult is contrasting the lifestyle of Israel. God says, you are going to be my image on the earth. You're not going to act like the Canaanites or the Egyptians. You're going to do everything completely different. For example, yesterday I was doing some research, asking the right questions. I'm asking questions. I'm saying, okay, so why is it that only during the whole year, during the feast, right, you have to do a sacrifice to start the first of the month of Nisan, or Aviv, right? New moon. Well, have you ever studied the Canaanite moon god and what they used to do and the representation of power and fertility, right? So now they have the first month of the spring. It's called Aviv. It's a Canaanite word, okay? The Canaanites knew that word. It means spring. And then it was called Nisan. Nisan too, when they went to Babylon, it's the same time period, different word, not a big deal. Okay. So what's interesting is that God says, no. During the first of the month, you're going to bring an offering to me. You're going to actually see the moon, but you're going to declare the moon because the moon is actually set aside to set your times and seasons, not to be worshipped. That's why Genesis chapter 1, verse 14, it says about the luminaries and that the sun and the moon were for times and seasons, moed. So the Canaanites believed that the moon was a god that had to do with life and death and resurrection. And God says, no, you're going to see the new moon. You're going to bring a sacrifice to the temple. So everyone would know that I control the new moon, that it has a purpose. It's going to set off my feast, my holy feast. Completely different. And here we are arguing about the new moon, but we have no idea of what the meaning of celebrating the new moon celebration in the temple and why it's connected to the temple and the sacrifices. Numbers chapter 28, verse 11. It's talking about the sacrifices. Okay? It's interesting that we found one of my friends who's here right now, one of my students, and a dear friend of mine, that women used to bake cakes during that same time frame and dedicated to the gods, and they had leaven. It just so happened that we are not allowed to have any leavened bread for 7 days, only in the spring. Only in the spring. Knock yourself out the whole year, but during this time frame, no leaven for you. Let that be found anywhere, you be cut off. Don't you dare have any leaven in your houses, not even around your town or whatever. Why? You have to ask the question. Why can you not have leaven? We use it all year because of the fertility rituals they used to do. So now we know that God is making a distinction. And here we argue about this stuff all the time. Instead of saying, I get it. I'm not going to eat leaven so that no one would ever say that I'm worshiping the gods of fertility. Even though we live in the 21st century, there's still a lot of idolatry and there's still celebrations of fertility. It's called Easter. We make a distinction. They may not call it unleavened bread like them, but they have little rabbits now putting out eggs, which makes no sense because they don't put eggs. Okay? It's the same thing, different colors, different type of images, but it's the same thing. Idolatry is idolatry. And we don't get it because we need to have love. We need to have love. We need to understand that we are in a covenant, but we can do whatever we want. I don't mean to be cynical or sarcastic, but that's a problem to God, specifically when the Jerusalem Council, the believers in the first century, they already set the standard of behavior for the believer, and everyone did it in the first century. Now we believe in Yeshua in the 21st century, and we don't want to learn the Torah, which was the book that they had to teach us those three things. They didn't have the letters of Paul. They didn't have any of the stuff. They only had the Torah and the prophets to teach us these things. But we don't want to follow it. Many people don't even study Torah anymore because, we follow Torah, but we just need Jesus. And that's the next thing. It's all Jesus-centric to the point that we're going back to the same system we were before, in which that we're not really, either we want to find Yeshua everywhere in the text, or we want to completely diminish the Torah because we have the Messiah. It's the same problem circling all over again. And I submit to you that we can have the Messiah forever present because the motifs are there that shows us the work of Yeshua. Okay? But we need to go back to the context. So when we see here, hopefully this makes sense to you, when we're looking at this information, now we're connecting dots. We're connecting that, wow, I did not know this. So watch this. Let's go to a little bit something else about the fertility cult. I want to read you some more information. And Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 1 through 12 talks about this. I don't really have time right now because I have to leave pretty soon. But I want you to take note of these verses and go back and look them up. We are told not to imitate what they do. In Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 29 and 31, says, when the Lord your God cuts off the nations from whom you are about to go to dispossess them before them, you have dispossessed them, and you have lived in their land. Take care that you are not ensnared into imitating them after they're being destroyed from before you, so that you not inquire concerning their gods, saying, how did these nations serve their gods, and thus I myself want to do also? God says that's not acceptable for my people. But if we don't understand how they did it, if we do not understand how they worship in Canaan, then how are we going to understand how they worship in Israel? If we do not understand how they worship the fertility rituals in the Greco-Roman world, how are we to understand why James cited the main core of the Torah and the book of Leviticus in regards to conduct of morality behavior, moral behavior? General term for religious marked by rites which reenacted a myth accounting for the orderly change of the seasons and the earth's fruitfulness. Such myth often involved a great mother goddess as a symbol of fertility and a male deity. So when we say Mother Earth, I don't use that term because that comes all the way from fertility rituals. Many people don't know it. Oh, but it doesn't mean the same. It's not a big deal, Rico. You such extremists. No, the language still means Mother Earth. It's not such a thing. You are implying that there is a cosmic sex for everything to come forth. When that's the reason why the Bible doesn't mention anything in regards to God having a consort. That's why you don't see that. God is trying to let you know, no, I control everything. Don't put me in the box thinking like the Canaanites or the Mesopotamians and everything is like that. Okay? It says, usually her consort, but sometimes a son who, like vegetation, dies and returns to life again. Now watch this. That's why there's no bestiality and there's incest. It's forbidden in the Bible because of their beliefs. The gods can be their son or the husband or whatever. Okay? Like the vegetation dies and returns to life. In Mesopotamia, the divine couple was Ishtar and Tammuz, who was born in Ezekiel 8:14. In Egypt, Isis and her son Osiris. In Asia Minor, Cybele and Athis. In Syria, Ugaritic myth on the second millennium BC pictured Baal Hadad, the storm god, as the dying and rising god. A local manifestation of this god is mourned in Zechariah 12:11. Syrian kings derived their names from this deity. His wife was the goddess Anat. Is the earliest Ugaritic myth Asherah, the great mother goddess who the consort of El, the chief god of the pantheon. As Baal replaced El as the major deity, he became associated with Asherah. Ashtoreth, the daughter of Asherah, is used as Hebrew word for womb or fruit of the womb in Deuteronomy 7:13, 28:4, verse 18 and 51. Fertility cults attribute the fertility of the cropland and herd to the sexual relations of the divine couple. Sacral sexual intercourse by priests and priestesses or by cult prostitutes was an act of worship intended to emulate the gods and share in their power of procreation, or else an act of imitative magic by which the gods were compelled to preserve the earth's fertility. You find it in those verses. Trans, what we see today, nothing new, right? That existed back in the ancient world, and the Bible prohibits it. Says the apparel of a man should now be put on a woman and vice versa. It has to do with worship. Okay? May have been part of the fertility rites that the practice of the Hittites, the sacrifice of produce, livestock, and even children in 2 Kings 17:31 and chapter 23:10. Represented giving the God what was most precious in life in an attempt to restore order to the cosmos and ensure fertility. You know what's interesting? Oh, I wasn't sharing. I apologize. What's interesting, okay, is that when you look into what God is doing, if you look at the last area here, they're trying to give fertility to the cosmos by giving of their sons. God dedicates the firstborn to him, not by killing them, but by giving them life. Same thing with the animals. That's why they go to the temple. The firstborn, the firstborn go to the Lord. Okay? And the firstborn born, a son, okay, now is dedicated to God. And then you have the redemption of the firstborn, which gives the right of the priest to be priest by redeeming the firstborn that were supposed to be priests. But they cannot do it now because of the sin of the golden calf. So the contrast is they believe that giving up their first or their best was a way to continue fertility of the land. And God says, no, I don't need death of the firstborn. I want them to live. It sets the contrast of the God of Israel to be a God of life instead of a God of death. And that's the difference between the ancient Near East and the Bible. The ancient Near East is about life. I'm sorry, the ancient Near East worship was about death. The Bible and the Torah and the temple and Israel are supposed to be about life. We're supposed to be an example of what not to do. Okay, so this is something that I want you to consider as you do your studies. I want you to consider. I want you to consider this. Okay, this is important. Okay, where are you guys? I'll make sure. Trying to figure out here what to do. Something happened. I don't know what's going on. Give me a second. There it is. That's it. So as you can see now, when you go back to the book of Acts, chapter 17, you can clearly understand that there's a lot of context that we don't quite understand. We don't know the culture of Rome and the Greco-Roman world. We do not understand um, when we read the Bible, the time frames, timetable, when the letters were written, by whom, who were the emperors when the letters were written, where were the letters written to, which audience and which geographical location, what was the problem in those places, what was the culture, what type of gods did they worship, were they a Roman colony, were they a free city, or were they something else? We need to learn these things, because if we don't, we're going to be hard pressed to understand the context of the Bible. We will really have a tough time understanding its meaning, understanding its context. And we will be really in trouble. We will be in big trouble trying to identify how do these verses apply to us, because we are out of space and out of time. So my research is basically to ask questions. I say, well, when James said this, who was he saying that to? When did he say it? What year did he say that? And then I start painting a whole panoramic picture around it, so that now I have a better, clear picture of the events that are taking place. So what have we learned today? Today we learned that James is actually correcting an accusation against Paul, because they were saying that Paul was teaching against the Torah and against the commandment, which that happened later in chapter 21. And Paul is saying, no, I'll take a Nazarite vow. James again told them, hey, do a Nazarite vow. He already took the vow, but he took 4 of the men with him. So they all may know that you walk orderly and you keep the law. Almost 28 years after Yeshua died and resurrected. So we have a lot of misinformation. And this is the number one reason as to why there's misinformation. The refusal to submit to the commandments of God. We are trying to justify that we are different people. And we're not Jews, so we don't have to do that. Well, I know we're not Jewish, but we, by grace, we are grafted into the tree. Now we want to move closer to that first century model. And by the way, the group that I have, my study group, is called Disciples of the Way, just like they were called in the first century. I'm not calling myself Hebrew Roots. Nothing against you guys. I want to continue to fellowship with you, break bread with you, visit your congregations. But I'm teaching a group that is trying to educate ourselves as the context of the Bible, so we can walk together in understanding what we're reading. And you're more than welcome. No one is excluded, and what we want to share, what we're learning. And I think it's important that you will consider searching these things and understanding what we're doing. And when you look into the first century and you start reading the letters of, the book of Acts, and when I went to Turkey last year, it was, wow, revolutionary for me. It changed my life. I was already a Torah teacher for a long time. I've been doing it for almost 26 years now. And, in this walk and teaching that 21, actually a little longer. No, teaching 24. Okay. Because I started in 98. So, and I learned so much in a short trip. I'm going back because I need to understand more. When I read Acts chapter 13 all the way to chapter 20, man, it's like, oh yeah, I know what it means. I was there. I walked on that street. I know the Bema. I know where he was. Oh, by the way, I know where he was arrested. I know where Lydia got baptized there by the river right outside Philippi. I've seen it. So that changes everything. So if you're interested, and going with me to Asia Minor, I am planning on a tour, hopefully in November. November, I'm planning on a tour to go to Asia Minor to do the full steps of Paul. We're going to go to Asia Minor, and then we're going to go to northern Greece, and we're going to end up in Athens. Hopefully, you'll join me. You're going to get to see what I'm trying to tell you. And if your life doesn't change, I know going to Israel is paramount and more important. Don't get me wrong. I'm going to go do the tour to Israel. I have one in May in Spanish. Okay? So, but I'm going to go back to Israel. But I think it's also important to teach you about the first century context of the letters of Paul and how relevant the Torah was to that community there. So if you want to learn more, go to wisdom.com, wisdomintorah.com, I'm sorry, wisdomintorah.com, and look us up. I have a temple course coming up in May 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, 2025. Go to the website, wisdomintorah.com, register, sign up, come on over. We're going to talk about sacred space, the garden, and the role of blood in the Bible. You know, blood manipulation. I think you're going to like that. We're going to be learning a lot. I pray today was a blessing to you. I pray that today was edifying, that you learn new things. And please understand that if I mention certain things in confidence, it's never with a mindset of arrogance, but confidence in the research and the information so that we can grow. Okay? So it's important that we consider that we owe to God complete loyalty to express our thanks and our reciprocity towards Him by becoming better servants and by learning how to walk according to His standards of holiness, not our own interpretations of what we think is holiness. May the Lord bless you and keep you guys. Thank you so much for joining me. And I'm always grateful for the opportunity to share, to extend my invitation to come and see the land of Israel and also understand the letters of Paul a little bit better. I'm learning and I'll share that with you. Just don't believe what I say. Go back and verify everything I say. May the Lord bless you and keep you. We'll see you guys next week.